All right. So we've been discussing, since last week, we've been discussing the different English Bible versions. We've talked about the King James, New King James, American Standard, New American Standard. Those are kind of what you call the big four. But then after that, we also have the NIV, the New Living Translation. Thank you, Keith. The New Living Translation. You have the NIV is the New International Version, the NET, the New English Translation. So we have a lot of different versions of the English Bible. And so we've kind of been discussing the differentiation, particularly in this last section that we've been talking about, is the difference between equivalent dynamic equivalence versus formal equivalence, or word for word versus a spectrum of thought for thought or paraphrase. Okay, and really that's the spectrum that we're dealing with. Is there's word for word, and then kind of in the middle is thought for thought, and then at the very end you have paraphrase. Okay, so this is the range of spectrum in terms of the different translations. Generally speaking, anything that's called essentially literal translation is kind of in the middle between word for word and thought for thought. The New King James actually kind of fits into that area, mainly because we talked about the difficulty of translating exact word for word. Sometimes it just doesn't make sense, and that's kind of what where we got to last week. Therefore, when we speak of faithfulness in translation, we need to clarify the question: faithfulness to form or faithfulness to meaning? Sometimes faithfulness to one involves lack of fidelity to the other. There are problems with each of these. The King James, with its attempted fidelity to form, that is as close to word for word as they could get, in some passages it makes no sense. And in 1611, they made no sense. The New American Standard, likewise, is often characterized by wooden, stilted English. And we talked about that kind of the way it flows and reads, it doesn't quite sound quite right sometimes in the way we would say it today. And that's what it means by wooden, stilted English. On the other hand, so this is on the other side of things, dynamic equivalence, and this is on that spectrum of thought to paraphrase. These translations sometimes are too interpretive. The NIV, this is the New International Version, in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 6, tells slaves to obey their masters, that's the context, is to obey their masters, not only to win their favor. And that word only is inserted there, it's not in the Greek. The word only is not in the Greek, and Paul did not mean to imply it either. This reveals one of the problems with dynamic equivalence translations. The translators don't always know whether their interpretation is right. And so when you start getting into thought for thought, and especially on past that particular spectrum into paraphrase, you really get into some major problems. And I'll show you what I mean here in a minute. Some versions don't interpret, they distort. And this is where you start getting into the paraphrase. Some are notorious for omitting references to Christ's blood or for attempting to deny his deity. In these instances, the translators are neither faithful to the form or the meaning. They have perverted the Word of God. Yet dynamic equivalence translators who are honest with the text often make things very clear. In Philippians chapter 2 and in verse 6, for example, the NIV tells us that Jesus was in his very nature God. Okay, that's in Ephesians 2 and in verse 6. And that's describing Jesus coming in the form of man and being a servant and so forth. But most formal equivalence translations state that he was in the form of God. The problem with these formally correct, again, form of God is technically correct. The problem with these formally correct translations is that they are misleading. The Greek word for form here means essence or nature, which is why, as he mentioned the NIV, the nature of God, he was deity, okay? He was divine. He was God in the flesh, okay? Now we can, especially those of us who've kind of grown up or are accustomed to the King James, New King James, the American Standard, and even the New American Standard to a certain extent, we kind of understand what that means. But in day-to-day vernacular, the concept of, in the form, he looked like God, okay? The modern vernacular leaves it kind of misleading for people who aren't familiar with the idea. Okay, you and I read in the form of God, and we understand that he was in his nature, he's deity. But we're used to thinking along those terms. Okay, most people who maybe are visiting, who maybe haven't studied the Bible very much, they wouldn't necessarily just understand that. Okay, whereas if you say in his very nature, his nature is God, then you can understand a little bit easier. Dynamic equivalence versus formal equivalence. These are two different philosophies of translation. A formal equivalence translation lets the reader interpret for himself, but too often the average reader, and keep in mind when the source says average reader, we're talking about cursory readers. Okay, not necessarily studiers, but people who kind of flip through or just kind of read and don't really maybe dwell on it too much. Too often the average reader doesn't have the background or the tools to interpret accurately, which is to say that especially given the word-for-word translations of the King James, even the New King James, the American Standard, and even the New American Standard, it takes study. Okay, and that's why he says the way he does, the average reader is generally people who just kind of flip through and kind of read through the chapters or whatnot, trying to glean something out of it, but not really delving into the text. The net result is that he often badly misunderstands the text, and we know that happens. Okay, we know that happens a lot. People go through, they read something that just kind of stands out to them. He calleth on the name of the Lord, and you shall be saved. Romans 10:13. Romans 10:13, right? Yeah, Romans 10:13. He that calleth on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Quoting from the Old Testament. And that's the kind of thing that stands out to people. That's the kind of thing, okay, well, that kind of fits in with what I'm thinking. On the other hand, a dynamic equivalence translation is usually clear and quite understandable. But if the translators missed the point of the original, either intentionally or unintentionally, they will be communicating an idea foreign to the biblical text. And unfortunately, when you start getting into the thought for thought and down along that spectrum into paraphrase, that's exactly what happens. In fact, there hasn't been a single translation on the other side of the thought for thought scale that doesn't take liberties in its interpretation. Now, I mentioned to you guys about this particular chart. It's in your notes. Let me see if I can make it bigger, because it's actually, this is a really neat chart. Go away, go away, go away, go away, go away, go away. Okay, here we go. There we go. Okay. So on the one side of this, you've got the word for word. You've got your interlinear. Okay, so the interlinear. This has the exact Greek, and then it has the exact English underneath, or as close as we can get to the translation of English. But if any of you who've ever experienced an interlinear, it's hard to read it by itself. Like, there's no way I could preach out of it, because you almost have to have a regular Bible with you and kind of look at how it's set up, because the way Greek was written and the way the Greek was read is just very different than our English. And as a result, so interlinear is exactly word for word, but it's very difficult to follow along because it doesn't follow the English structure that we're used to. Okay, so then you have. And the way they have it, again, to a certain extent, this can be a little subjective in terms of how a person sees it, but I don't necessarily disagree with any of the placements on here, other than the fact that the caveat is that all translations, no matter what they are, even the King James, the New King James, there are certain places, certain times that you kind of wish a different term was used. We talked Sunday, about the fruit of the Spirit. Okay, and in that third term that we looked at there in Galatians chapter 5 and in verse 23, that term that is translated gentleness in the New King James, I really wish it said meekness, like the King James does, because it makes it makes it a little bit easier to understand that this is not just an action. This goes to the heart of an individual and how they see themselves and how they see others. Certainly, gentleness is a manifestation of meekness, and remember, we talked about that term specifically there. Even meekness itself, in our modern language, carries the connotation of weakness, and that's not the case. Okay, and so there's not really an English word that we can use to exactly translate that, but meekness to me certainly is the closest. And it kind of makes it a little bit more difficult because in the King James, there's a separate term for gentleness as opposed to the New King James, where you start getting all confused because of the different words, because they translate them differently. And so there are times, even in the New King James, that you kind of wish there was a little bit different phrasing or a different word that is used to translate it. But that's not to say you can't understand the passage. Obviously, all of these, especially in the word for word, going up to pretty close to that thought for thought, close, not all the way there, but close, you can understand the passage as it's meant to be understood. Certainly, understanding what the actual terms mean in the Greek helps you to have a deeper appreciation and a deeper understanding. We've been created in Christ Jesus for good works. Okay? We've talked about that in Ephesians chapter 2, how that we've been created in Christ Jesus for beneficial works. That's the term specifically. Not that those works aren't beautiful. They are, because they're in service to God. But specifically, we're created to do works that benefit others. And in particular, as God has authorized, we don't just make it up as we go along, but these are things that are designed to help others come to Christ. So you've got the NASB, let me add, and I meant to add it in my notes. I don't know if I did or not. The Amplified version, be very careful with that one. I don't even know if anybody uses the Amplified. I have a copy of it in my office. But the Amplified version, there's some issues there with some of its translations. While it is a word for word, technically, there's also some areas where the Amplified is very odd in some of the things that it says. So just kind of as a side note there. Yes. Yeah, you've got synonyms with the amplified, and then you've got, it's almost like commentary attached to it also. And it's really strange. I think I have a paragraph in here somewhere about the Amplified a little bit here in just a minute, I think. You have the ESV, that's the English Standard Version. You have the RSV, that's the Revised Standard, I think, because the NRSV is the New Revised Standard. King James, New King James. The HCSB is the, I actually have a key down here. I don't have to remember it. Holman Christian Standard Bible. I don't know. I haven't known anybody who actually uses that one. And then on down this scale as you get closer and closer to the thought for thought, which is to say that instead of actually translating the Greek word, they translated the thought process. Okay, here's what the thought is here. God forbid. Even the King James does this a little bit. God forbid. Okay, we looked at last week how that phrase, God forbid, in and of itself isn't really there in the Greek. It means let it never be so. Okay, and so that's kind of an example of a thought for thought moment where the King James, instead of translating it literally, this is how they would say that. The NRSV, which is the New Revised, the NAB is the New American Bible, the new NJB is the New Jerusalem Bible, then you've got the NIV. Notice where the NIV sits on that scale. Okay, it is not really a word for word. It is a thought for thought. Not to say that that's any of these thought for thought Bibles. There's nothing wrong with having some of these. Okay, if you want to kind of look at some of these and read it, compare it to kind of how maybe if you're struggling with a passage, don't take. I was going to say don't take it for gospel, but don't take it to be exact necessarily, because again, the thought for thought is based on the interpretation of the individuals who are translating it. But for instance, if you're struggling with a particular passage, trying to keep track of what the thought process is, open up the NIV and just kind of read how it presents it, and maybe it'll help you a little bit. Certainly going to the Greek terms, can help you. I would suggest maybe even more so. But sometimes reading it in our own maybe way of saying it, more modern way of saying it, can help. Okay? But the further down the scale you get, the more cautious you must be. The TNIV, which is today's New International Version, that's just a kind of a modern version of the NIV. You've got the NCV, which is the New Century Version. NLT is the New Living Translation. That's probably one of the more popular ones on this side of the scale. And the remaining ones, I would highly recommend, if you wanted to look at one while you're in a bookstore, that's great. If you want to buy one, I highly recommend that you don't. Simply because, and I'll show you some examples, because I actually am including some examples of some of these passages that are translated a certain way, and you'll see what I mean. Then the NIRV is New International Reader's Version. The Good News Translation is the GNT, or the Good News Bible. Sometimes you'll see people from community churches, a lot of times with the Good News Bible. I've seen a lot of people carrying the Good News Bible. That's on that paraphrase side of things. I think that's separate. I think that might be separate. The Good News Bible and the Good News Translation are just kind of variations of the same type of book, I think. Now it may be related, like it may be the same publishers or something like that.
I remember that one when I was high school, college age,
Yeah. I don't know. I haven't heard of that one. Yeah. Snoop?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many people are studying, but I've picked up copies of some of these, like at thrift stores, to have them so I can do what you're saying.
Yeah. If you're studying with somebody, especially.
I actually bought a new international version for children. So I could use it when I was teaching because they have like some devotionals in there, and stuff like that, in more of a kid's language than,
Sure.
So those help. Something like that Holman Christian Standard Bible, those I've looked at. I stay away from them because the ones I've picked up have a ton of commentary.
Yeah. And especially if they say study Bible, that almost always means there's commentary from somebody in it. Yeah.
And the other thing I want to say is that if a person is truly searching, the Bible is not hard to understand.
No, it's not.
The passages that save us can be easily understood.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this is right, but this is what my brain is telling me. The Bible actually reads on about a 5th grade level.
Yep.
And so anybody that's truly searching and isn't trying to twist it, right, and make it say what they want it to say, can come to know the truth.
Sure.
And there are stories about people who just sat down and read it and knew, they read it through many times and knew that what they were reading didn't match with what was happening where they were going to church.
Mm-hmm.
And they have come to know the truth.
Right.
So, the thing is and I just want to say one more thing about the interlinear Bible. If you are struggling, I have one you can look at, borrow, whatever. Etymology, I believe, if I'm saying it right, is the study of a word.
The root of a word, yeah. How we got those words, yeah.
Right. And so, like I mentioned earlier, that I needed to do my own personal study about head covering to figure out for me if what I had been raised doing was the right thing, right? So I was told, go figure it out, basically. And that was how I did it. The Interlinear Bible I have has 3 lines for one word. It's Greek, Hebrew, and English or something. And sometimes there's this much space between, a word. Because it takes that long to
translate it, yeah.
Yeah. But if you're looking and you're searching because you're confused about something, going all the way to an Interlinear Bible, is it going to clear it up? It might clear up a word.
Right.
You cannot sit down and read.
Can't read from it. I can't preach from it. There's no way I could preach from it.
You can't even read it.
Yeah.
But you can do word studies.
Sure.
You can see the context before, and you can get kind of, it's broken. Like, it doesn't even sound like you're speaking English.
Right. Yeah.
But it is a great study.
It's a good tool, yeah.
Especially, and then, just, if you are looking for a new Bible, study this chart.
Yeah.
They all read different.
Yeah.
The first Bible I was given by my grandparents was Revised Standard. My mom used the New American Standard, and I currently use the English Standard, right? So I have copies of a lot, and if I'm studying a specific thing, how do they say it, and is it
Yeah.
true?
Yeah.
You know, and so, yeah, most of us stick with what we,
Right.
you know.
And you know, as Snoop was talking about how they all read differently, that's because there's a lot of different ways to say the same thing in English to bring out different aspects of it. Just like the King James, New King James, with gentleness versus meekness. One's emphasizing the action, the other's emphasizing the inward heart of it, whereas the term itself expresses both, plus the lack of weakness in it. And so, taking that into account, there's several different ways you can get there in the English to make that clear, even though even though I had to use a whole sentence just to say it. There's ways you can translate that, and it reads a little bit differently to bring out different aspects of that term. But that's one of the beautiful things about the Greek language, well, especially the New Testament Greek language, is that it was so precise and so specific in the things that it said and the way it was said that it creates the need for us to really actually not just read but study. There's a difference between reading and study. Yes, Nick?
Well, and we're so blessed today because even 25 years ago, you couldn't pull up 4 translations on a computer and read all 4 of them at once, or pull up a lexicon, or pull up Vines, or whatever it is. You need an interlinear Bible to say what was the Greek word and what did it mean.
Yeah.
We have that.
Mainly for scholars and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we have that. So if you need to know I don't, if you're struggling and you need to know exactly what a word means, go back
Well,
to it.
Strong's concordance. You got the Strong's numbers next to it, and you can look up the Greek term. That's how I do it. Because Vines includes his Strong's numbers in there, and so you can compare and contrast which ones are which, and so it really does help a lot. It really does.
It totally does. It gives you a clearer understanding because, like we've talked about many times, just the word love in the English language
Yeah.
and what it said in the original language. I mean, ours, you don't know if I romantically love it or if I brotherly love it or if I just love it because it skills, right?
Yeah.
I mean, but in the original language, there was a difference.
There was no confusion.
And so
Yeah.
I guess what the caution that flies up for me is, like you brought out meekness and gentleness, I can't assume that I know what that means just because I have a definition of meekness in my head.
Right. That's our modern idea of meekness.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In what you told us Sunday, it was without meekness.
Right.
Which makes it extremely strong. Like
Oh yeah.
being in submission.
Right.
Is a strength.
Yeah. Being able to bring myself under, or to endure, or to respect authority, or in the case of Galatians chapter 5, I may have the right or the power to do something, but that doesn't mean I should do it. It may not be what's best. And so being able to restrain myself, self-control is an aspect to it. Yes, ma'am?
Well, when you talked about gentleness earlier, the thought that came to my mind was the gentle giant.
Yeah.
You've got these guys that are just massive and they could do anything they wanted, but they don't.
They control themselves, yeah.
So
Yeah.
they're gentle, but they have the power.
Sure. All right. We have the Good News Translation, Good News Bible, Contemporary English Version, and then on the tail end of the scale here, you have the Living Bible and has anybody had any experience with the Message? Anybody?
I don't even think I've picked one up to read.
If you ever have anybody you're talking to who's reading from the Message, you're going to have to be very, very careful in how you deal with them. Even to a certain extent, the Living Bible has some really, really strange stuff. The way there is not really any translating being done. Okay, there are some cases where they even leave verses out completely in terms of their paraphrase. There are certain specific verses they just completely leave out. Just not even mentioned. Yes, ma'am.
I've got a second version of the Message called the Message Remix.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes.
I haven't heard of that one.
Oh, yes.
All right, then.
I just read a verse in the Message today.
Which verse did you read?
Matthew 5:13.
Light of the world, yeah.
Let me tell you why you are here. You're here to be salt seasoning that brings out the God flavors of this earth. If you lose your saltiness, how will people taste godliness? You've lost your usefulness and will end up in the garbage.
All right then.
I mean, it's not wrong.
I mean, that particular, I mean, I can go along with most of that. It's just, yeah. But I mean, there are times where it is wrong, just wrong. All right. Anything through that so far that we've talked about with the scale and the different translations? And I don't want anybody to walk away saying, oh no, I'm using the wrong translation or I need to buy a new translation. I mean, if you feel like you need to, that's fine, but don't think that I'm up here condemning all other translations. But I highly, highly recommend that if you're doing serious study and this is something you're basing your soul upon, anything on this left side of the scale here, from thought for thought all the way down to word for word, that's what I would recommend, and the further or the closer to the word for word, generally, if you're able to kind of follow along with it, is better. Again, I probably wouldn't go much further there than the NIV. And again, even the NIV, there's certain things it's just a little bit off. Yes, ma'am.
Sharon and I were talking the other day about she thinks she might need a new Bible. She said, I hate the new Bible because she's taken all those notes in
Yeah,
there
yeah.
about kindness and gentleness and whatever else. And then my friend Ryan Boyer, he had his Bible rebound because he's got so many things in it,
Yeah.
clarifications for himself or whatever. He didn't want to have to start over.
No.
And so, and then he wrote a thing one time. He said, a Bible is not an accessory; it's a necessity. So we don't buy Bibles based on how they look or
Right.
Whatever. It's our sword. We should carry it with us always.
Sure.
And be able to use it.
Yeah. Yeah. For years, up until, well, since I've been here, I guess at least, I had a little New King James Version Bible. And they don't make that. My brother has the exact Bible. And in fact, I was tempted to take his, but it has his name on it. Preacher stole his brother's Bible. And so you have this New King James, but it's real handy, okay? Because you can kind of, it's just real handy when I was preaching. And I got so used to not necessarily remembering like certain passages that I may not use all the time. I may not remember the exact book, chapter, and verse, but I knew exactly where it was. Well, my kids tore out, I think it was Exodus chapters 23 and 24 and 25, and then they tore out some of Matthew, and other pages got torn in half. So I was going to buy a new one. And when I couldn't find the exact copy of the one that I had, I was looking at other ones in the bookstore, still New King James, and it was hard for me to really remember where everything was I wanted to look at because I was used to it being next to this and in this context and doing this and this. So it's kind of weird how you kind of get attached to a certain, not just a Bible, but also kind of where everything is on the page. And so when I started doing the digital Bible instead, just because it's all there and I don't have to, do a lot of page turning and stuff like that, it kind of cuts down on my time of preaching and so forth a little bit. I'm kind of gotten used to it now. But one thing about it though, I do have the NET on here, and I thought about preaching out of it last Sunday, and I was reading through it, and I'm like, this doesn't sound right. It's not that it was wrong. It's not the New King James that I'm used to, or even the King James. I grew up with the King James, so I kind of even sometimes I go back and forth with it sometimes. But the NET, I was just kind of like, oh, it doesn't flow quite the same, and that's okay. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with just the original King James. There's nothing wrong with that. All right. Anything else through all that? All right. At one end of the spectrum is the word-for-word translation, also referred to as a formal equivalent or literal translation. This approach seeks to represent the original Greek and Hebrew in a more word-for-word manner and preserve, as far as possible, original word order, grammar, and syntax. Many prefer this method because each Greek or Hebrew word is generally represented by the same English word in all occurrences. And that makes it a lot easier, especially if you're looking for a word study or a cross-reference, to understand where this word is used elsewhere, not just the English translation of that word, but the actual Greek word. That makes it a lot easier. Whereas in some of the thought for thought, and especially the paraphrase, that word may not even be there in that translation. Some of the more literal translations include the King James, the New King James English Standard, the New American Standard, the American Standard certainly would be included in that. The most literal translation is the interlinear, which contains the text in its original language with the English equivalent under the text. Sometimes you can get, as Snoop mentioned, you can get the English and the Hebrew, and some even have even the Aramaic versions of it too, and the Greek. So there's all that. On the other end of the spectrum, we find the thought-for-thought translation, also referred to as paraphrase, and that's really just kind of the scale, thought-for-thought paraphrase, or functional equivalent. This approach is more concerned with putting meaning of the passage in a colloquial language familiar to the reader. This type of translation seeks to render the ideas of the original text as accurately as possible in the target language, like English. Many find this translation more readable, especially for new readers. A translation's premium is on the thoughts and ideas expressed in passages rather than translating each phrase word for word. This philosophy is necessarily interpretive. And that's for that exact reason I tend to suggest, especially if you're talking to people and they're wanting to learn about the Bible, maybe they've never really studied it or anything, and they're asking you what translation to buy. You don't have to tell them the King James. That's kind of hard for a beginner to kind of read through with the thys and the these and all that stuff. But something like the New King James or New American Standard or the ESV would be a little bit easier. But notice that one of the things that the source says, many find this translation more readable, especially for new readers. That's true. Many do find it more readable. But the problem is, especially in the cases of that further down the scale, you're sacrificing accuracy for readability. And that's not good, okay? Especially when it's up to the translator as to what that means. Not good, okay? NLT, CEV, NJB, the Phillips New Testament, Living Bible, the Message, all part of that. The middle of the spectrum is occupied by a dynamic equivalent or mediating translation. These translations seek to strike a balance between the two translation approaches. So on kind of the more word-for-word side of that, you have the New King James, which tends to be more word-for-word, but also has some thought-for-thought there. But then on the other kind of side of that spectrum, you have like the NIV, which tends to be more thought-for-thought, but still some word-for-word in there too. They are sometimes more literal, sometimes more colloquial or conversational, depending on the subject and text. Some examples in this category are the NIV, the Holman Christian Standard, the New American Standard, or New American, Bible. A parallel Bible contains two or more translations for easy comparison. I actually think I have one or two parallel Bibles. I know I have at least one between the American Standard and the King James, mainly because those are two separate, distinct text types that we talked about, the Byzantine versus Alexandrian. That's kind of helps you a little bit with that. So talking about in terms of translation and our view of translation, we believe that A, the Holy Spirit not only inspired the thoughts of the Bible writers, but the words themselves. B, we believe that thoughts cannot be disconnected from the words that produce them. And C, we believe that intended biblical cross-references will get obscured when word-for-word translation philosophy is not employed. I include this particular concept in terms of that C aspect, that the cross-references, because when you read, for those of you who have big enough Bibles, you have that kind of middle cross-reference, or you have under the text you have cross-reference. That is there, and by necessity, it has to be word for word, at least close to it, so that you can know where that is elsewhere. Okay, you can't have that cross-reference in something like the Message or the New Living Translation, because the words aren't what's important in those translations. But we believe that the words are important. The details are important. All translations, in fairness, employ both ideas in their philosophy. That's why I include no, not all, most maybe, but things like the Message and the New Living Translation and certain others on that end of the scale, translating is always to some degree a trade-off between accuracy and clarity. Anyone who is bilingual knows that the best translation is not always the most literal. Again, the interlinear we were talking about. That may not be the best translation because it's in broken English. Okay, it's not in any structure at all, and that's what it means. So here's some examples. Okay, Psalm 2 and verse 7. In the King James, I will declare the decree, the Lord has said unto me, thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. In the New King James, it's basically the same thing, except the haths and the thous and so forth. You are my son, today I have begotten you. The American Standard says, I will tell of the decree, Jehovah said unto me, thou art my son, this day I have begotten thee. Between the three, when you read through that, you can follow along with each one, and it's virtually identical, right? At least in terms of as we read it in our mind, it's the same thing. Compare that to the CEV. I will tell you, promise the Lord. Will tell you, promise the Lord. I copied it straight from I think it means I will tell you the promise the Lord made to me. You are my son, because today I have become your father. It kind of removes the begotten part of it, which certainly, remember we talked before about the idea of begotten, but the focus is on the son. Focus is not on the Father. Focus is on the Son in that text, whereas the CEV takes this a little bit differently. The Message, let me tell you what God said next. He said, you're my son, and today's your birthday. Today's your birthday. Living Bible, his chosen one replies, I will reveal the everlasting purposes of God, for the Lord has said to me, you are my son, this is your coronation day, today I am giving you your glory. Do you see what it means by paraphrase, and maybe not even paraphrase in this case, in the case of the Living Bible, it's almost explanatory paraphrase. That's not there. That's not in the text, okay? Even the concept of the idea of coronation, certainly we understand that the idea of being begotten and so forth, he was proven to be the Son of God in Romans chapter 1 and verse 4 by God raising him from the dead and so forth. We understand that's associated with the resurrection. But was Jesus coronated? No. In fact, we never read anything like that in the New Testament. In the sense of glory, okay, I can understand glory, but really, even then, he was on the earth for 40 days after that, after his resurrection. He was received up into glory at his ascension in Acts chapter 1. Okay, it's weird. Okay, it's weird, and it's not accurate. And that can really kind of lead you, like the Message. If you just took that text for what it says, today's your birthday, the whole concept of prophecy flies out the window. Okay, it doesn't really fit the prophetic nature of today I have begotten thee as it's used in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9.
I wonder how the people that use that translation, today's your birthday, how do they reconcile that with December 25th?
I don't know. I don't know. For all I know, the Message includes December 25th in there. I don't know.
You should read the next two verses with verse 7 under the Message.
What does it say?
This is not even anything. So let me tell you what God
Oh no.
He said, you're my son, and today's your birthday. What do you want? Name it. Nations as a present, continents as a prize. You can command them all to dance for you, or throw them out with tomorrow's stretch.
Wow. Oh no.
There's nothing there.
Oh no, Trice. Don't read anymore. All right. We'll stop there. We will finish this next Wednesday night, and we'll get into history of the different denominations and churches and so forth. We won't spend, I decided we won't spend 1 week on each denomination. I think we'll kind of do a little bit of a overview. All right? Thank you, everybody.